Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome everybody, welcome to those in person, on Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook. We'll start our Shabbat services with Moda'ani on page 186. Turning to page 192, we focus on the intimacy and beauty of our community. Ma tovu alecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael, ve'ani barov chastecha, vo beitecha eshtaka v'ohecha, kadshecha b'yiratecha, Adonai ahavti ma'on beitecha makon mishkan kivodecha. V'ani ashtachava ve'echrev lefnei Adonai osi v'ani tefilati lecha. Adonai et ratzon Elohim berov chastecha. Aneni bi'emet yishacha. We are on page 194 with Asher Yatzar.
Praise to you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who formed the human body with skill, creating the body's many pathways and openings. It is well known before your throne of glory that if one of them be wrongly opened or closed, it would be impossible to endure and stand before you. Blessed are you, Adonai, who heals all flesh, working wondrously. Baruch atah Adonai, rofei chol basar umafli la'asot.
Amen. Focusing on the unique importance of every individual, we turn to page 196 for Elohai Neshama.
Elohai Neshama, shenatata bi tehorahi. 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 I offer thanks to you, Adonai, my God, and God of my ancestors, source of all creation, sovereign of all souls. Praised are you, Adonai, in whose hand is every living soul and the breath of humankind. Baruch atah Adonai, asher beyado nefesh kol chai, veruach kol basar ish.
Amen. We turn to 198 for the daily miracles.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who has given the mind the ability to distinguish day from night.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who opens the eyes of the blind.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who frees the captive.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who lifts up the fallen.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who stretches the earth over the waters.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who strengthens our steps.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who clothes the naked.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who gives strength to the weary.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who removes sleep from the eyes, slumber from the eyelids.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who has made me in the image of God.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who has given me free will.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who has made me a Jew.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who girds Israel with strength.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who crowns Israel with splendor.
Amen.
We continue on page 204 with the blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. O Adonai our God, let the words of Torah be sweet in our mouths and the mouths of your people Israel, so that we, our descendants, and the descendants of all your people Israel may know you by studying your Torah for its own sake. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah li'amo Yisrael.
Amen. We continue with Elu Devarim in English, page 206. These are things that are limitless, of which a person enjoys the fruit of the world, while the principle remains in the world to come. They are honoring one's parents, engaging in deeds of compassion, arriving early for study, morning and evening, dealing graciously with guests, visiting the sick, providing for the wedding couple, accompanying the dead for burial, being devoted in prayer, and making peace among people. But the study of Torah encompasses them all.
We flip to page 212 for Baruch She'amar.
Baruch She'amar v'haya ha'olam Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo Baruch Choseh v'Reshit Baruch Omer v'Oseh Baruch Koser u'Mekayem Baruch Merachem al haaretz Baruch Merachem al habriot Baruch Meshalem Sachar Tov Lireav Baruch Chai La'ad V'Kayam Lanetzach Baruch Podeh U'Matzil Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo With songs of praise we extol you and proclaim your sovereignty, for you are the source of life in the universe. One God, life of the universe, praised and glorious ruler, your name is eternal. Melech Mehula, Batish Bachot, Melech Mehula, Batish Bachot, Baruch Atah, Adonai, Melech Mehula, Batish Bachot.
Amen. We turn to page 214 for Mizmor Shir.
Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. 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 Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat.
We look to page 215 for Ashrei.
Ashrei Yoshvei B'techa Od Yehalelucha Selah. 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 Ashrei Yoshvei B'techa עוד יהללו, עוד יהללו חסלה. אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד יהללו, עוד יהללו חסלה.
תהילה לדבר המלך, לחי המלך ובשמך לעולם ועד.
בכל יום אברכך והללה שמך לעולם ועד.
גדול אדוני ומעולם מאוד, גיליתי תהילתו אין חקר.
דור לדור ישבח מעשיך וגבורותיך יגידו.
הדר כבוד הודך ורדיף נפלתך עשיך.
ועזוז נורותיך יאמרו וגדולתך אספרנה.
זכר רב טובך יביעו וצדקך ירננו.
חנון ורחום אדוני, ערך אפיים וגדול חסד.
טוב אדוני לעכו ורחמיו על כל מעשיו.
יודוך אדוני כל מעשיך וחסידיך יברכוך.
כבוד מלכותך יאמרו וגבורתך ידברו.
להודיע לבני האדם גבורותיו וכבוד עדל מלכותו.
מלכותך מלכות כל עולמים ומשלתך בכל דור ודור.
סומך אדוני לכל הנופלים וזוקף לכל הכפופים.
הנה כה לך יסברו ואתה נותן להם את אכלם ביתו.
פותח את ידיך ומשביע לכל חי רצון.
צדיק אדוני בכל דרכיו וחסיד בכל מעשיו.
קרוב אדוני לכל קוראיו, לכל אשר יקראו באמת.
רצון יראיו יעשה ואת שבתם ישמע ויושיעם.
שומע אדוני את כל אוהביו ואת כל רשעים ישמיד.
תהילת אדוני ידבר פיו ויברך כל בשר שם קדשו לעולם ועד.
ואנחנו נברך יה מעתה ועד עולם.
Hallelujah. We are on page 218 for Hallelujah.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. כל הנשמה תהלליה. Hallelujah, hallelujah. כל הנשמה תהלליה. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
נשמת כל חי תברך את שמך אדוני אלוהינו ורוח כל בשר תבער ותורם זכרך מלכנו תמיד מן העולם ועד עולם. אתה אל אין לנו מלך אלא אתה אלוהי הראשונים והאחרונים אלוהי כל הבריות אדון כל הדעות המעולה ברוב התשבחות המנהג עולם עולם בחסד ביראתה ברחמים ואדוני לא ינום ולא ישן ומער ישנים ומקרץ נרדמים והמשיח אלמים והמתיר אסורים והסומך נופלים והזוקף כפופים לך לבדך אנחנו מודים. We are on page 220 for Ilufinu.
Ilufinu מלא שיר הקיים אור לשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלכנו אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלך מלכי המלכים מלך מלכי המלכים מלך מלכי המלכים לופינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות.
We are on the top of page 222. Ha'el b'tatumo tuzecha hagadol bekavod shemecha hagadol hanetzach v'na'ara b'na'atecha hamelech hayoshev al kisei ram v'nisa.
שוכן עד מרום וקדוש שמו וכתוב רדנו צדיקים באדוני לא ישרים נבות תהילה בפי ישרים תתהלל ובדברי צדיקים תתברך ובלשון חסידים תתרומם ובקרב קדושים תתקדש ומקלות טובות עמך בית ישראל ברינה יתפאר שמך מלכנו בכל דור ודור ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו האל המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ובארץ כי לך נאה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו שושבחה לבזמרה עוז ממשלה נצח גדולה גבורה תהילה ותפארת קדושה ומלכות ברכות והודאות מעתה ועד עולם ברוך אתה אדוני אל מלך גדול בתשבחות אל ההודעות אדון הנפלאות הבוחר בשירי זמרה מלך העולמים. חצי קדיש, page 224. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה בעלמא יברך יראתי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומכון ובחייתך בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעלמי המעיין יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קדושיו בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירן בעלמא ואמרו
Amen. We rise for Baruch Hu on page 226.
Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach
be seated. We turn to page 228. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, yotzer or avrach hashem, choseh shalom v're'at koho. Ha'me'ir la'aretz ledarim meleh barachamim, yutova mechadesh b'chol yom tamid, ma'aseh bereshit, marbu masach Adonai kulam b'chachma asita, mala aretz kinyanecha, titbarach el Eloheinu ashafach maseh yadecha, ve'al me'orei or she'asita v'ruchasela, or chadash al tzion ta'ir, v'nizke kulanu mehereh le'orot, baruch atah Adonai, yotzer ha'me'orot.
Amen.
Before we start Ahava Rabbah on page 230, we again take a collective deep breath, focusing on this idea of Ahava, of love. As the Mishnah says, the purest type of love is Ahava shelo talui bedavar, love that is not dependent or conditional on anything. And we imagine and envision, especially on Shabbat, what our world can look like if we increase our unconditional love for everyone, regardless of shape, sizes, political opinions. Please join me on page 230 for Ahava Rabbah. Ahava Rabbah, Avtanu Adonai Eloheinu, Chemla Gadola v'Torah Chalmata Aleinu, Ba'avor Avatenu v'imatenu Shabbatu Becha, v'Tamidem Chukei Chaim, Ken Techanenu u'Tamidenu, Hamerachem Rachem Aleinu, v'Ten B'Leibenu Lahavenu Lahaskio, Lishmoa Lilmod Lilamed, Ulashmor Ulasod Kayem et Kol Divrei Tamut Tartacha B'Ahavaha. Enlighten our eyes with your Torah, focus our mind on your mitzvot, unite our hearts in love and reverence for your name. Then we will never feel shame, never deserve rebuke, and never stumble. Having trusted in your great and awesome holiness, we shall celebrate your salvation with joy. Gather us in peace from the four corners of the earth and lead us upright to our land. For you, O God, work wonders. You chose us, truly. You drew us near to your great name, that we might acknowledge you, declaring you one in love. Praise be to you, Adonai, who chooses your people Israel in love. Baruch atah Adonai, habocher ba'amo Yisrael, b'ahava.
Amen. We continue with the Shema, page 232. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And I would like to invite Samuel to join me up here at the podium and help us lead Ve'ahavta all together as one and not by yourself. May as well, you're going to lead the whole service a week from today, so come on, you'll be fine. Come join me. Ready? Ready? Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha ubechol nafshecha ubechol me'otecha ve'hayu hadevarim ha'ele asher anochi metzabecha hayom alevavecha Veshinantam lebanecha, v'dibarta bam, v'shivtecha b'veitecha, v'vlechtecha b'derech, v'v'shochbecha uv'kumecha, uv'shartam ne'ot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha, uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha u'visharecha. Can you read that?
Adonai said to Moses as follows: Speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages. Let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner. That shall be your fringe. Look at it and recall all the commandments of Adonai and observe them, so that you do not follow your heart and eyes in your lustful urge.
Leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'yitem kedoshim le'Elohechem
אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם אלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אמת.
אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. תודה רבה, Samuel. That was wonderful. Thank you.
We continue on the top of page 238. ויציבהו וחביב ונורא ואדיר וטוב ויפה הדבר הזה עלינו לעולם ועד. אמת אלוהי עולם מלכנו יצור יעקב מגן ישנו לדברו קיים ושמו קיים וכיסו נכון ומלכותו ואמונתו לעד קיימת ודרב חיים וקיימים נאמנים ונחמדים לעד עולמי עולמים. ממצרים גאלתנו אדוני אלוהינו בבית עבדים פדיתנו על זאת שיבחו אהובים ורוממו אל ונתנו ידידים זמיר שירו ותשבחות ברכות והודעות למלך החי וקיים. רם ונישא הגדול ונורא, משפיל גאים ומגביה שפלים, מוציא אסירים ופודה ענבים ועוזר דלים ועונה לעמו בעת שבתם אליו. תהילות לעליון ברוך ומברך, משה ומרים ובני ישראל לכהנו שירה, בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם. We are on Micha Mocha on page 240.
Just and chord. מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עושה חדשה, שיבחו גאולים לשמחה על שפת הים. שירה חדשה, שיבחו גאולים לשמחה על שפת הים. יחד כולם הודו והמליכו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. צור ישראל קומה בעזרת ישראל, ובטחנו מחה יהודה וישראל. גאלנו אדוני צבאות שמו, קדוש ישראל. אלי ברוך אתה אדוני גואל ישראל.
We are on the top of page 242.
אדוני שפתי תפתח ופי יגיד תהילתך. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, Elohei Avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'konei Hakol, V'zocher Chasdei Avot v'Imahot, U'mevei Geula livnei b'neihem, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם בעזרת שרה.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע, מוריד הטל.
מחכה חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים.
רחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומידה מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה,
ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים.
אמן. נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב על יד נביאך, וכרז אל זה ואמר, קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוך על הארץ כבודו. אדיר אדירנו אדוני אדוננו, מאדיר שמך בכל הארץ, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אחד הוא אלוהינו, הוא אבינו, הוא מלכנו, הוא מושיענו והוא ישמיענו, ברחמיו לעיני כל חי. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהי ציון לדור הדור. הללויה. לדור ודור נגיד גודך, ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש, ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. We continue silently. Shalom. יהיו לרצון אמרתי והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני צורי וגואלי. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, Adonai, my rock and my redeemer. We're on the bottom of page 260. Ose shalom bimramav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei Shalom Aleinu ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן. Ay ya la 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 ya la ya la la ya la la ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 ay ya la 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 ya la ya la ya la la ya la la ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 ose shalom imroma ya se shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen ve'imru amen.
We turn to page 362 and rise for the taking the Torah out of the ark.
Ein kamocha v'Elohim Adonai Cohen ve'ein kamasecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim u'memshaltecha bechol dor v'hador Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai yimnoch le'olam va'ed Adonai os le'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom Ki mision tetzeh Torah Ki mision tetzeh Torah u'devar Adonai miYerushalayim Baruch shenatan Torah Torah Baruch shenatan Torah Torah le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo Gadlul Adonai iti Oneromema Shemo Yachdav Ay ya la ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya ay la ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ay ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la ya la 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 ya la ay ya la 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 ya la 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 ay ya la ya la 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 ay ya la 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 ya la 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 Adonai os le'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom Adonai os le'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. You may be
You may
seated.
be seated.
So we're here at Parsha Naso, which I think Rabbi Nico mentioned last night is the longest Torah portion in the entirety of the Torah. So I thought it would only be fitting for this to be the longest of our Torah of the year. Totally kidding. But we're here just in the narrative arc of the Torah. This is the Parsha that I sort of think in my head in terms of category as the miscellaneous Torah portion. Because what happens is, dozens of weeks ago, we left Egypt, we made it to Mount Sinai, we received the Torah, we spent the last several weeks learning about the building and the materials of the tabernacle, we spent several weeks learning about how to service the tabernacle in terms of the daily routine, and now all of a sudden we're here at the second Torah portion in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, and we sort of imagine the Israelites, they're all set up, they have the guidebook, they have the portable tabernacle, they're wandering through the desert, and now they're simply going about life. And it turns out when you start to go about life, interpersonal issues arise that no law book, no matter how good, can account for all of them. And so we start seeing in this week's Torah portion all sorts of issues that were apparently not addressed earlier on at Mount Sinai that are now coming up. So we get a lot of what ifs in this week's Torah portion. And one of the most interesting, troubling, unique, you can choose your favorite adjective once I describe it, but one of the most fascinating laws in this week's Parsha concerns a what if a man becomes jealous and subsequently suspects his wife of committing adultery. And the Torah describes a long process. She's called the Isha Sota, a woman of suspicion. And what happens is the Torah describes in the 11th verse of the 5th chapter of Numbers that if a man suspects his wife of cheating on him, of committing adultery, but he has no proof, right? He can't go to the legal court. What does he do? So he takes her and he brings her to the priest that's sitting at the tabernacle, and this priest concocts an entire ritual that there is no parallel to in the entirety of Jewish tradition. What he does is he makes this grotesque mixture of dirt, of water, of certain other materials, and then at the last moment, he writes down a curse, including God's name on a piece of parchment. He then, I promise I'm not making this up, you can look in the 5th chapter of Numbers, he then takes the parchment and dips it into the water so that the parchment gets washed away and gets dissolved into the water, and subsequently gives it to this suspected wife. She drinks it. And then, as the Torah says, right, we can probably all imagine what happens next. If she's guilty, then bad things will happen to her. And if she's innocent, then she'll be fine. She won't get sick. Now, of course, there's a lot to say, right? Contemporary scholars have already, of course, connected this to the idea of witch hunts, right? You throw somebody in the river. If they drown, well, they were a witch. If they can swim, somehow, oh, it was never meant to be, right? So there's a lot of, I think, initial troubling factors surrounding this. Other contemporary scholars, interestingly enough, I was considering talking more about this, but just as an interesting aside, connect this actually to an ancient abortion ritual, perhaps, of trying to ensure that she's not impregnated with another man. But the Talmud also has trouble with this, albeit for a couple of different reasons. The Talmud has so much trouble with this that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the first century rabbi who's sort of credited with starting the rabbinic tradition, actually abolished this ritual. And so they asked him, and he said, no more sota. But the Talmud asks another question. Last week was Shavuot, right? And we sat here last week and we read the 10 Commandments. And for people who are counting, the third of the 10 Commandments is, don't take God's name in vain. And Jewish tradition takes this idea of not taking God's name in vain to radical proportions, right? We know that if we have a Torah, if we have a Siddur, if we have anything with God's name on it, even if that thing is no longer in use, we never throw it out, right? We actually bury it, right? We put it in a room called the Geniza, right? We keep it for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And basically, in Jewish tradition, once God's name is written on something, that thing is not erasable. And so the rabbis look at this scenario in the Torah, and they say, well, wait a minute. We just learned a couple weeks ago, one of the most important things is you do not erase God's name. All of a sudden now, you're telling me this entire ritual is centered around writing God's name on a piece of parchment and having that dissolve away. And so in wrestling with this question, the rabbis derive a fascinating principle, a principle that takes this seemingly archaic and problematic ritual into something that I think has a lot to say about the way tradition and social progress have to work in tandem with each other. The rabbis derive a principle saying that so great is Shalom Bayit, so great is interpersonal relationships, peace between family members, wider communal peace, so great is Shalom, peace, that even God allows his name to be erased. The Talmud immediately then goes into a story, and we're introduced to a young scribe, a person who spent their career writing Torahs, named Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir apparently was quite an innovative fellow, and he developed this type of ink that had iron sulfate in it. I won't pretend like I actually know what iron sulfate is, but he developed this iron sulfate type ink, which apparently was permanent. And so you can imagine him as developing the first Sharpie in history, right? Once you write a Torah with this iron sulfate, nothing in the Torah can be erased. And, you can imagine he's this young scribe. He's probably very proud of his new invention. And so he goes to his rabbi's house. His rabbi was Rabbi Yishmael. And he's bragging about this a little bit. And he's telling his rabbi, I developed this incredible ink. And his rabbi said, okay, what's so special about this? And he said, well, every time I write any religious material with it, it's permanent, right? It's almost as if it's etched in stone, right? Nobody can erase it. Nobody can tamper with it. Isn't this beautiful? And Rabbi Yishmael, interestingly enough, quotes this earlier concept from the Talmud and says, well, actually, we learn from this ritual of erasing God's name in this curse that you're not allowed to write a Torah with permanent ink. Now, if we take a step back and try to understand this metaphor, it becomes an incredible idea. What Rabbi Yishmael is saying is that there's a problem when religious tradition becomes so etched and so permanent that it can't be changed, that it can't be touched. That there's a certain element in Jewish tradition that we learn, the rabbis, interestingly enough, derive from this really unique case of the Sota wife, that says that actually, in order to have a viable and a tradition that's able to progress forward, you're not supposed to write in unerasable ink. Now, it doesn't mean that the ink should be pencil, right? It doesn't mean you should be able to erase any second you want. But this metaphor of ensuring that tradition is malleable enough for the end, which is peace and harmony between people, is a fascinating conclusion. So the Talmud then tells us that Rabbi Meir, this young scribe, grew up, and all of a sudden he's the big shot rabbi of his community. And we're introduced to another final story about him, where one Shabbat night he was sitting and his Devar Torah apparently did last for hours, and he was teaching Torah on Friday night, and it was getting later and later and later. And there was a certain young lady that was sitting in the audience, and she was so captivated by the speech that she completely forgot that she had made dinner plans with her husband and family, and she stayed there for an extra hour, 2 hours. And so the Talmud says she waited until he was finished speaking, and then finally she went home. But when she went home, and you can imagine this scenario, the light was already extinguished, the food was already cold, and her husband sitting there, right, you can imagine one of these big armchairs saying, where have you been, right? A case that's eerily similar to our story in the Torah of he's presumably thinking if his wife was out late on a Friday night, she was up to no good. And so, of course, she says, well, no, don't suspect anything suspicious. I was just listening to Rabbi Meir. But the husband didn't believe her. And the husband said, and I quote, I swear by God that you are not able to re-enter this house until you go and spit in the rabbi's face. And so you could imagine, right, this wife is in a little bit of shock, right? It's usually not a good thing to do to spit in people's faces. And so the Talmud says that she went to her friend's house And she sat there for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and it's been 3 weeks since she's been home. And her neighbors and friends started to tell her, hey, listen, it seems like things aren't going so well. Let's go talk to Rabbi Meir, right? Let's go see if he has any wise words. And so she goes with her friend to Rabbi Meir, again, this young scribe turned big shot rabbi. And Rabbi Meir saw them, and he immediately was able to envision or to tell or decipher what happened. And so Rabbi Meir says as follows. When they came in, he said, before you tell me anything, I have a question. Are any of you guys medical professionals? He didn't use that term. He used charmers, but right, if we're thinking of the modern case, right, are any of you medical professionals? And they said, no, not really. And he said, well, I have something stuck in my eye. And I've read that the treatment for getting something stuck in your eye is to have somebody spit in your eye 7 times. And this young woman, right, obviously is very on the fence. And she said, like, Rabbi, I don't know what I'm doing, right? I've never recited this charm before. I've never given this treatment. And Rabbi Meir said, just spit 7 times and don't worry, I'll be healed. And so she acquiesced, right? She spits in his face 7 times. And he turns to her and says, now you go home and tell your family, you only asked me to spit in Rabbi Meir's eyes once, but I spat 7 times. And so she goes home, right? And you can imagine, right, this scenario, right? This took place on a Shabbat morning, right, in front of dozens, if not hundreds, of Rabbi Meir students. And so she leaves, and you can imagine the scenario. The students turn and they say, well, what are you doing, right? Is this any way to treat your respect, right? You're the leader of a community. Why are you coming up with this public story in which now you've presumably been embarrassed? And Rabbi Meir replies, if it's good enough for God, it's good enough for me. And the student said, what do you mean? And he said, we've already learned in the Talmud that so great is this idea of peace that even God allows his name to be erased in order to ensure interpersonal harmony. How much more so can I, Rabbi Meir, just flesh and bones, allow my dignity, allow a little bit of embarrassment for such a valuable end? And so we learn through this story, right? We go back to Sota, and there's still a lot of problematic elements, right? We haven't solved all of the issues, and we can still read the story. And I implore, when you're reading the 5th chapter of Numbers, right, think about this, think about the pros and cons, right? And there are a lot of cons of such a ritual. But the way in which this becomes a part of Jewish tradition ensures that we always recognize that what we're doing in Judaism is a means to an end. And that end truly is to better the world. So much so that God allows his name to be erased, so much so that we don't actually allow our tradition to ever be so etched in stone as to not be malleable enough for interpersonal harmony and progress. Shabbat Shalom.
May we have the microphone now for Torah reading?
Racha Batsi, Bach Caron, Bernifa, Barbara Levine, the first to lead. And reading will be Rabbi Miriam Van Roll. Thank you.
Baruch Adonai mevarach le'olam vaed. Amen.
וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל אהרון ואל בניו לאמור, כה תברכו את בני ישראל, אמור להם, יברכך אדוני וישמרך, יאר אדוני פניו אליך ויחונך, יישא אדוני פניו אליך, וישם לך שלום, ושמו את שמי על בני ישראל, ואני אברכם.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נתן לתוכנו ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Yamdu, Yamdu, Aliyah Hasheni, Moshe ben Yitzchak, and Batya bat Shlomo, Marty and Batya Schwartzman, and reading is Nitzachenik.
Wait, you took mine. You took mine.
Baruchu et Adonai hamavorach.
Baruch Adonai mevarach le'olam vaed.
Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bacha banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
ויהי ביום כלות משה להקים את המשכן וימשח אותו ויקדש אותו ואת כל כליו ואת המזבח ואת כל כליו וימשכם ויקדש אותם ויקריבו נשיאי ישראל ראשי בית אבותם הם נשיאי המטות הם העומדים על הפקודים ויביאו את קורבנם לפני אדוני 6 עגלות צב ו12 בקר עגלה על 2 הנשיאים ושור לאחד ויקריבו אותם לפני המשכן.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu torat emet v'chayei olam natan b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Yamdu, Yamdu, Aliyah Hashlishi, Mordechai ben Yehuda, B'chaya Kaila, Mark Filowitz, and reading Mark Filowitz. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, kach meitam v'hayu la'avod, et avodat ochel moed v'notata otam el ha'levim, ish kefei avodato. V'yakach Moshe et ha'galot, v'yav habakar v'yitain Otam el halevim, et shitei hagalot, v'et arbaat habakar, nachan livnei geroshon, kimi avodatam, v'et arba ha'agolot, v'el shemor, abarkach livnei morchi, kfi avodim, v'yad ishtam vein yacharon v'hakochen, v'livnei ketam lo natan, ki avodam hakodesh eilechem, kifotef yeshau, v'yikravu v'nishim, et hanuchat hamizbeach, v'yom hamashot, otam v'yikravu v'nishim, et karbam lifnei hamizbeach. And even though I missed the first part of the bracha, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher notan lanu torat emet v'chayei olam notah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Yamdu, Aliyah HaShlishi. No, this is actually maftir. Sidl Rivka Bat Shmuel Veleya Lila Pesner, and reading will be cantorial fellow Gabriel Newman.
Baruch Adonai mevarach le'olam va'ed.
Kol Hamim.
Amen. Kol bakar lo shnei masar parim elim shnei masar kevasim b'nei shana shnei masar uminchatam usirei ozim shnei masar lechatat v'cho bekar zevach hashlomim esrim v'arba parim elim shishim atudim shishim kevasim b'nei shana shishim sod hanukat hamizbeach acharei hamashach oto uvevo Moshe el ohel moed ledaber oto v'yishma et hakol midaber elav ma'al hakiporet asher al Aaron ha'adat mi ben shnei hakevarim v'yidaber elav. Shalom. Amen.
We turn to page 370 for the Mishaberach for everybody who received an aliyah or helped out in the Torah service. Mishaberach avotenu ve'imotenu Avraham Yitzchak ve'Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah hu yivarach et kol ha'olim ba'avor shalu lechvon ha'makom u'lechvon ha'Torah b'zchar zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu yishmarehu v'yatzilenu mikol tzara u'tzuka u'mikol nega u'machla v'yishlach bracha v'etzlacha b'chol masei yadehem im kol Yisrael v'no mahar. Amen. Before we recite the Mishaberach for healing on page 371, we invite anybody with names of anybody this Shabbat in need of any type of healing to recite their name or to type their name into the chat.
Jonathan Kaysen, Marla Kaysen.
Mishaberach avotenu ve'imotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah hu yivarech et kol hacholim, hakadosh baruch hu yimalei rachamim aleihem lachmilam ulev refuatam, ulahachzikam v'yishlach lehem mehera refuah shalema min hashamayim, refuat hanefesh v'refuat haguf, hashta bagalai uzman kariv v'nomar amen. We rise for the lifting of the Torah with Hagbah.
וזאת התורה אשר שם משה לפני בני ישראל על פי אדוני ביד משה. השלושה דברים, השלושה דברים, שלושה דברים העולם עומד. שלושה דברים, שלושה דברים, שלושה דברים העולם עומד. עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה, ותומכיה מאושר דרכיה, דרכי נועם, וכל נתיבותיה שלום. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש עמנו כקדם.
We remain standing for Aleinu on page 586.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגאל עלינו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו
You may be seated. We turn to page 598, and before we recite the Mourner's Kaddish, we want to highlight people in unique stages of mourning this Shabbat. If you are in the first week after the passing of a loved one, please rise or please write their name in the chat. If you're in the first month, the Shloshim period. If you're in the first year after the passing of a loved one. And if you're commemorating a yahrzeit this Shabbat. Please join me for Mourner's Kaddish on page 598. Please rise. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
Be'amad dibra kiratei, be'amlich machutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchayedecho beit Yisrael, b'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen.
Yehi shmei rabbah mevarach le'olam u'lamei amaya
Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shmei dekudisha brichu. Le'ela min kol bechata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechamata, tamiran b'yama v'imru amen. Yehi Shalom Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Min Ramav Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. You may be seated. So we will hopefully see everybody back here at 5 p.m. today for Rabbi Nico's farewell Havdalah. We're going to be starting at 5, and we're going to be doing a special mincha service starting at 6:30. Next week we have Samuel's bar mitzvah. So if you enjoyed Shema today, there's
that's true.
Plenty more.
Ve'ahavta is a part of Shema.
What?
First in the know, Ve'ahavta is a part of Shema.
Yes. And then the week after, on Saturday, June 25th, is Sydney and Josh's B'nai Mitzvah. So plenty of simchaot, plenty of celebrations, both today and over the next 2 weeks. Please join us for Adon Olam for the conclusion of services.
Why am I having a hard time?
On a to-be-determined page.
625. Thank you. Adon Olam Hashem Alach B'terem kol Yetzir nivra Ha'et nasa v'chefzo kol Azai melech shemo nikra Azai melech shemo nikra Ve'acharei kichlot hakol Levado yimloch nora Ve'hu hayna Ve'hu hover Ve'hu yiyeh betifara Ve'hu yiyeh betifara Ve'hu echad ve'en sheni Le'am shelo le'achbira Velo haos ve'hamisra Velo haos ve'hamisra Vehu edi v'chai goli V'tzor chevni be'etzara Vehu nisvi umanosli Menat gazi be'yom ekra Menat gazi be'yom ekra Ve'yadov kidruchi Ve'eti shan ve'ayira Ve'imruchi Geviyati Adonai li Ve'lo hira Adonai li Ve'lo hira Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person, on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And we hope you can join us on person or on Zoom this evening. Thank you, everyone.